Hello and welcome everybody to the 12th Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference, for the first time held virtually. But we're very glad because we can reach lots of people, hopefully of a wide range and reach. We've just had the address from the Minister this morning, and really good to hear from her and obviously from the whole of Welsh Government. This next session, the first session that we'll be holding, will be here till 3:15. Please do ask questions throughout this session. There is a ability for you to ask questions through the chat function that you should be able to see on your screens at the moment. So we really want to hear from you to be able to address questions. So I have great pleasure in welcoming Dave Goulson. He's Professor of Biology at Sussex University, specialising in bee ecology. And many of you will know him as a founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, author of many influential books on bee conservation and the plight of insects. He is highly respected in academia with over 300 published articles and many awards recognise his important role. He's a great orator, and he's been doing a great deal communicating about the plight of insects, and was recognised as the 8th most influential people in conservation by the BBC Wildlife magazine. I know him as a trustee of the Action for Network, and also as an ambassador for the Wildlife Trust. And his work is much needed. This focus on insect loss and the fundamental need to address this. So I look forward to his talk and his continued campaigning work. So over to you, Dave.
Dave, are you there? Dave, we can't see you or hear you.
Okay, I don't know why my microphone turned off. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, but we can't see you. So turn your camera on, please. And
okay, it just kicked me out. They were all working a moment ago, but there we go. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Let's assume everyone else can. Sorry about that little glitch. I think these online technologies are amazing, but they never work totally smoothly. I'll start again. Thank you very much for the introduction, Rachel. Today, as you'll have gathered, I'm going to be talking about insects, my favorite subject, I guess. I've spent my whole life being fascinated by insects. One of my earliest memories is when I was only about 5 or 6 years old. I found these little yellow and black caterpillars on some weeds growing on the edge of the playground at school, and I put them in my lunchbox and took them home and reared them up, and they eventually turned into these beautiful red and black moths. You'll guess, many of you there, cinnabar moths, but I thought this was magic. I was completely hooked, and I've been really lucky that I've managed to make a living out of chasing around after insects, which is brilliant. But I think I'm not alone in having started out with a kind of fascination with insects from an early age. This is my my youngest son, Seth. Picture is a couple of years old now, but there he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Colin sadly is no longer with us, but Seth is still really into his insects. He likes to capture them and hold them in his hand and put them in jam jars and rear them and feed them and so on. And I think lots of people do go through that phase, but the sad reality is that most people grow out of it, and by the time they're teenagers or adults, their reaction to anything that buzzes near them is usually to try and swat it. They're frightened. They think it's going to sting them or bite them or give them a disease or something. And I think that's really sad, because I love insects. And so my mission in life is to try and persuade other people to love insects, or at least, if that's going a bit far for some people, to at least respect insects, because they're enormously important, as I'm going to explain. But before I do, let me give you a bit of preamble, a bit sort of set the scene. And this may seem a bit obvious. Oh, try again. There we go. But bear with me. So this, of course, is our planet. I'm sure you recognize it. It's an extraordinary thing. We don't often stop to think about it, but it's this rock hurtling through space with life clinging to its surface, maybe as many as 10 million species of animals and plants. We don't know. We've named about 1.5 million so far, but estimates suggest there are many more yet to be discovered. And this planet gives us, it's our home, it gives us everything. It's water, food, air to breathe, source of inspiration and beauty. And therefore it's just extraordinary and inexplicable that we're treating it so recklessly, that we're causing so many problems for our planet. These are some of them, but there are many more. Climate change is, of course, the most familiar. And as you'll have heard, that some scientists predict that within as little as 10 years, we could be in a runaway process where we can no longer stop climate change. And that could really have devastating consequences for the planet. But climate change isn't the only major issue we face, although you might be mistaken for thinking it is, because it's the one that gets most attention. But there are many others, and they all interact. So the soils are eroding, we're polluting not just the air, but the seas, the rivers, the soils with plastics and heavy metals and fertilizers and pesticides and so on and so on. We're still chopping down or burning down tropical forests and over-harvesting fish in the seas and so on. I won't go into all of them. My real focus is on biodiversity loss, and most scientists agree that we're now in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event, that species are now going extinct faster than they have for 65 million years since the dinosaurs were wiped out by the meteor. But this time, uniquely, this 6th mass extinction event is the only one that's been caused by a species on the planet, obviously us. Now, a lot of conservation effort tends to focus on large mammals and birds. When you talk about extinction events, people tend to think of these big charismatic animals, not so much of smaller creatures like insects. And I think that's a bit of a shame. And also, I think we focused a bit too much on extinctions and not so much on the overall loss of bioabundance. So if you look at the numbers, only a few hundred species have gone extinct in the last 500 years that we know of. There are probably a lot more that have gone extinct, particularly insects that we don't know of. But anyway, the actual number of species gone extinct, so far as we know, is relatively small. But if you look at the figures for how the actual numbers of individual animals have changed, it's really quite terrifying. So there was a recent report that estimated the total number of vertebrates on the planet and how it's changed since 1970. And so vertebrates obviously includes birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. And the total number on the planet of wild vertebrates is estimated to have fallen by about 60% since 1970. Well, I was 5 years old in 1970. Well, just to give you a figure from closer to home, for the UK, the population of breeding birds in the UK has fallen by about 110 birds every hour since I was born in 1965. Isn't that absolutely terrifying? It's mind-blowing. Every hour for the last 50 odd years. Extraordinary. Anyway, I would argue that until very recently, we'd overlooked perhaps the most profound change that's been going on, which has been the decline of our insects. We pay much less attention to insects than we do to birds or mammals, I think rather sadly. But 3 years ago, a study was published by mainly German entomologists. I was one of the authors as well, but I didn't do terribly much, I must confess. The work was done by German insect fanatics who've been sampling insects across Germany using Malaise traps since the 1980s. A Malaise trap is that funny looking thing top right there, which it catches all flying insects. And the chart shows you the weight of insects caught per trap per day and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. So it's a 26-year period, and you can see it fell pretty dramatically. In fact, the overall catch fell on average by 76% in 26 years. So 3/4 of the flying insects in Germany seem to have disappeared in a really rather short period of time. And this kind of caught the world's attention somewhat, at least. The first time I think that the world's media has really talked much about insect declines. And it made people wake up to the fact that there is a problem. Now, I could show you lots of other corroborative similar charts from other places, but suffice to say that all the evidence we have is that this isn't a problem that's confined to Germany. I could show you charts for butterfly abundance in the UK, for example, or moth abundance, or ranges of bumblebees and hoverflies, and they're all pointing in the same direction. We seem to be in the midst of a period of really rapid decline in the abundance of wild insects. And that should worry us enormously, because insects are hugely important. As was explained by an American biologist, E.O. or Ed Wilson, now in his 90s. I won't read out his quote in its entirety, but he basically said if people were to somehow disappear from the planet, that the planet would be just fine without us. But that if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos, as he put it. And I want to explain why he thought that's the case and why I would very much agree with him. So I mentioned that we've so far named about 1.5 million species of animals and plants. Well, 1.1 million of those are insects. They make up the bulk of life on Earth. And the life on Earth that isn't an insect very often depends on insects for food. So most species of bird, bat, lots of freshwater fish, amphibians, reptiles, they all eat insects. And without insects, then they too will decline. So for example, if you imagine you're one of these beautiful bee eaters living in Germany, then 3/4 of your food supply has disappeared in the last 26 years. And that's inevitably going to have impacts on the birds and everything else that feeds on insects. Of course, insects do many other things apart from being food. Because they're so speciose, there are so many of them, they're involved in more or less every process you could care to think of on land. I should say there are essentially no insects in the sea, but lots in freshwater and lots on land. And they're biocontrol agents of crop pests. They're intimately involved in nutrient cycles, in the recycling of things like dung and dead bodies and trees and leaves and so on, and in keeping the soil healthy. You name it, any kind of ecological process you can think of, it involves insects, which is why Ed Wilson said the environment would collapse into chaos. Without them, these fundamental ecological processes would stop happening. Now, of course, the thing that insects do for us, which is best recognized, is they're pollinators. People tend to focus on bees as the main pollinators. My particular research specialism is bumblebees, so I'm somewhat biased, but I have to say up front that bees are certainly not the only pollinators, and sometimes they're not the most important. It depends on the plant, but there are also moths and butterflies and lots of species of flies and wasps and beetles, all busy pollinating. One recent estimate suggests that there are at least 4,000 species of pollinating insects just in the United Kingdom. So it's certainly not just bees. But between them, these insects pollinate 87% of all plant species on the planet. So the very large majority of plants depend upon pollinators. And 3/4 of the crops that we grow. So we've become accustomed to our shops, our supermarkets being full of this amazing array of fruits and vegetables. We kind of take it for granted, don't we? We just know that when we turn up, it'll all be there from all over the world. But it wouldn't be there, or most of it wouldn't be there, if it weren't for insect pollinators. So if we took away the pollinators, then most of the fruit and veg that we eat wouldn't be available. 3/4 of the crops that we grow need pollinating. So we wouldn't have things like apples or cherries or strawberries or raspberries or pumpkins or tomatoes or chili peppers, or even things like coffee and chocolate need pollinating by insects. So you know, life would be dire indeed without those things, and more importantly, people would die. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But the lives of millions of people are at stake here. If we don't have pollinators, then we won't have enough food to feed everybody. Certainly not enough healthy fruit and veg. So we need to avoid ending up like these people. These pictures, you may have seen them before. They've been shown quite a lot, but they show people in southwest China. They're hand pollinating their apple and pear trees because there are no bees left. There are no pollinating insects left. So the only thing left is for the people to pollinate the flowers themselves. They send their children climbing up the trees to pollinate the higher flowers. Now that's just about economically viable, it would seem, in China for a high value crop like these apples and pears, but it's hard to imagine a farmer in the UK hand pollinating his oilseed rape fields. So we need to make sure that this doesn't happen here. And if we're going to do that, we need to understand why insects are declining if we're going to do something about it. So why are insects declining? Well, there are lots of drivers. It's complicated, as of course the declines of all wildlife are. There's no single factor driving them. Loss of habitat is probably the biggest one, followed by exposure to pesticides, and I'll say a little bit more about those two things in a second. But there are many others. The spread of foreign diseases. We've accidentally spread insect diseases around the planet, and that's had big impacts on bees in particular. Climate change is starting to kick in. Fertilizers have quite profound effects through their influence on plant communities. Light pollution affects nocturnal insects, and so on and so on. There are lots of problems our poor insects face. Let me just say a little bit more about the first two. So loss of habitat first. The one habitat that we used to have lots of, which was probably one of the most important habitats for insect diversity in the UK, particularly for pollinators certainly, was species-rich grasslands, hay meadows and chalk downland and so on. And the Maca in Western Scotland, which is what this is a picture I took in South Uist of some Maca habitat, which is still there, but very similar grasslands occurred all over Britain. 100 years ago, we had about 7 million hectares of this habitat in Britain, but in the 20th century, we destroyed 97% of it, almost all. And this fantastic insect and flower-rich habitat was replaced by more intensively managed farmland of one sort or another, either arable crops or, from a Welsh perspective, perhaps more relevant, by improved pasture. And it's a matter of opinion whether it's improved or not, really. But monocultures, or something close to monocultures of plants grown for our benefit, replacing habitat that used to be extraordinarily diverse in plants and insects and bird life and so on. Obviously, that kind of wholesale habitat loss has really profound effects on wildlife. In fact, our landscape has changed more than I think many of us really appreciate, because it's happened relatively slowly. I came across these pictures from Western France recently, which I thought were really interesting, although a little sad. So these are aerial photographs taken of a part of Western France. And the first top left, that picture was taken in 1958, and it's a time series of exactly the same place through to 2010, bottom right. And you can see what happened, but I've never seen it so dramatically illustrated. And these changes have happened over 50 or 60 years. So we've hardly noticed. And now when we look at the landscape, a lot of people think it's always looked like that. These big fields, But actually, it didn't always look like that. Only 60 years ago, it looked really quite different, this patchwork of tiny little fields. Obviously, this is France, not Britain. But broadly, so far as we know, similar things have happened here. We know the fields have got steadily bigger and are still getting bigger in the UK. Of course, some countries have taken this even further, and I couldn't resist putting in this picture from North America, where they do monoculture cropping on a scale which thankfully we can't rival. And it's also happening in the tropics, sadly. We're all painfully familiar. We've seen pictures of, this is of course is oil palm being planted in what was previously beautiful rainforest teeming with life. All of these examples of pretty dramatic habitat loss from an insect's perspective. Okay, so the other driver of insect declines I just wanted to say a tiny bit more about was pesticides. Farming has become very reliant on pesticides in the last 60, 70 years, to a point where the last count, according to DEFRA, farmers in the UK apply 16.9 thousand tonnes of pesticides to arable crops each year, and that's not including pesticides used on livestock to prevent parasites and so on, or pesticides used in gardens and urban areas. That's just farmers, 16.9 thousand tonnes. And each arable field on average gets treated 17.4 times a year. That's a mixture of insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, molluscicides. And there's abundant evidence that this impacts. Of course it impacts. The idea really, the farmer seems to be trying to maintain a single crop and wipe out everything else, essentially. That seems the basic principle of monoculture farming in the modern era. I will argue later that I don't think this approach is sustainable. Anyway, it's easy to see why insects are declining given all of these changes to the landscape. What can we do about it? Lots of conservation stories are really depressing. We feel helpless in the face of climate change to some extent, or when you see the rainforest in the Amazon on fire on the news and you think, oh, this is awful, but what on earth can I do? Well, the good news here is that insect declines are things that we can all get involved in addressing, because they live all around us. They're in our gardens, they're in our parks, they're in the fields where we walk the dog. They're everywhere still, thankfully, and they breed really fast, and they can recover. They could recover very quickly, much more quickly than, for example, rhinos or pandas. If we just give them the right habitat, if we just give them somewhere to live, insects will thrive in no time at all. And we can do that ourselves. We can do small things in our gardens and get a tangible result in a very short space of time. So I'm going to talk today about two areas where we could really make a difference for insects. And I'm going to start off by talking about urban areas, which I think is one of the easiest wins. This is a kind of no regret solution to at least partial solution to insect declines. In the UK, we have 22 million gardens. That's an area of nearly 500,000 hectares, bigger than all of our nature reserves put together. And that's without counting the parks, the road verges, the roundabouts, the cemeteries, all the other urban green spaces that could be managed for nature. And people are already buying into this. If you go to your local garden centre, you can see plants labelled as bee-friendly, pollinator-friendly, encouraging tapping into the fact that there is a demand there, that people want to invite butterflies and bumblebees into their gardens. And I think we need to encourage that more, because there's a huge potential to turn our cities and towns into a giant network of essentially miniature insect nature reserves. I think that would be absolutely amazing and could go some way at least towards halting and reversing insect declines, at least for some species. I got so excited about this, I wrote a book, The Garden Jungle, available all good bookstores. I won't plug it anymore. But I will talk about some of the things that are in the book. So, although I've started off by saying that, gardening has this amazing potential to support biodiversity, and I believe that it does, it also has the potential to do environmental harm. It really depends how you do it. Gardens can be rich in wildlife. There's a fantastic example of a garden. So there's a lady called Jenny Owen who lives in Leicestershire. In Leicester itself, in fact, she has a small, very small suburban garden. It's less than 1/8 of an acre. But she spent the last 35 years identifying everything she could find visiting her garden. And she managed to accumulate a total species count of 2,600 species, just under 2,000 of which were different types of insect, and then obviously birds, mammals, plants, and so on. Extraordinary that a tiny garden can support 2,500 species of animals and plants. But of course, a garden like the one I'm showing you now would support almost nothing. This is actually it's my worst nightmare. This is an astroturfed, plastic grassed garden. You can buy plastic shrubs these days. You can even buy plastic ivy to pin on your plastic fence. I'm sure not many people listening have a garden like that. I please hope you haven't. But nonetheless, many of us are guilty of some of the more taking part in some of the more negative aspects of gardening from a sort of consumption point of view. Many of us, have an idea of the weekend. We might drive to the garden centre, get a big trolley and put in a plastic sack full of peat-based compost and then some bottles of pesticide and a whole bunch of pretty plants grown in disposable plastic pots, probably grown in the peat-based compost, almost certainly sprayed with lots of pesticides, and buy them and take them home. That, of course, actually, as soon as you stop to think about it, is obviously not exactly great for the environment. Now, I won't go into the peat story here at all, but I hope everyone listening knows, please don't buy peat-based composts or plants grown in peat-based composts. It's really bad for the environment. The other issue I just touched on here is pesticides. And I mentioned earlier how many plants are sold as the garden centres put logos on them, like this RHS one, perfect for pollinators, which correctly identify plants that are attractive to pollinators. But what that label doesn't tell you is that most of those plants are full of pesticides. And I say that with certainty because we've studied this at Sussex Uni. We drove around all the big name garden centre chains, Homebase and B&Q and Yvale and so on. And we bought the plants they were selling as bee friendly or perfect for pollinators. And then we tested them for pesticides. And nearly every single plant contained at least some pesticides. 75% of them contained insecticides. And 70% of them contain things called neonicotinoid insecticides, which are particularly notorious for being poisonous to bees. And these are being sold as perfect for pollinators, which is certainly ironic and arguably illegal. As much surely trading standards or someone should have a say in that. Anyway, just beware that gardening like that and garden centres themselves are not necessarily the most green of enterprises. But that's not to say that gardens can't be fantastic for wildlife. They can. It just depends how you do it. So perhaps the first thing to consider when thinking about how you might make your garden more insect friendly is what plants to fill it with, what flowers to grow. And there are a few very simple rules. I haven't got time to go into this in great depth because there are thousands of species of plant available, many of them really good for wildlife and a few not so much. It's interesting that all flowers evolved, of course, in the first place to attract pollinators. That's what a flower is for. They're not there for our benefit. The plants have evolved colourful petals and scents and so on to attract pollinators. But we've tinkered with flowers, sadly, over hundreds of years. Plant breeders have selected for things that they thought people would like. And in doing so, they've sometimes made plants useless from an insect's perspective. So here we've got 3 examples of flowers which are widely available in double varieties along the top. It's a rose and a cherry and a hollyhock. I'm sure you recognize them. And beneath them are the single varieties, the more natural varieties. The single varieties are all really attractive to pollinators. The double varieties are more or less useless because they're mutants in which the anthers that would naturally produce the pollen have mutated into extra petals. So that lovely hybrid tea rose top left that you might give someone on Valentine's Day, from a bee's perspective, is an abomination. It's useless. It's just a bundle of petals with no pollen. So if we could point people towards avoiding these double varieties, it'd be a very simple step. And I have to say, I think the single varieties are much more beautiful. Anyway, they're a bit of a mess, aren't they, those doubles? Likewise, most annual bedding plants have been intensively bred for huge, showy blooms, long flowering periods, and sadly, in doing so, they've lost their original purpose. They're no longer attractive to insects. So we should get rid of these hideous things and replace them instead with, well, there's lots of advice out there, including YouTube videos of mine about which are the best garden plants for pollinators and so on. Reams and reams has been written about this. Not all of it's super accurate, but there's lots of good information out there. And broadly, herbs and cottage garden, old-fashioned cottage garden perennials tend to be good. Things like catmint and lavender and so on. This is catmint, of course. Do bear in mind, there have been some interesting studies done recently showing that not all catmints are equal, not all lavenders are equal. So although it's generally true to say that catmint is good for bees, and it is, you can see there, bumblebee enjoying drinking nectar from catmint. But if you grow the different varieties of catmint side by side, you find that some are much more attractive to pollinators than others. And the best performing catmint from a bee's perspective is this one, which is called Six Hills Giant. So if you really want to maximize, your insect attraction in your garden, you need to actually find out which variety is the absolute best. Sometimes we don't know because no one's yet done the research. But for catmint, go for this one, and for lavender, go for Gros Bleu, which is that attracts more than 4 times as many bees as the worst performing lavenders. If you really want to know more about all the details as which varieties are best and so on, then I've written another book, but this one isn't out yet. You have to wait till April this spring before you can buy a copy of Gardening for Bumblebees, but please do if you're interested. Okay. Something else to bear in mind in your garden is I would love it if people could be a little more tolerant of native flowers that are often described as weeds. We've slightly arbitrarily decided that some plants are undesirable, and we branded them as weeds, and we persecute them relentlessly. We spend lots of time trying to dig them up, get their roots out, or we buy herbicide and spray them off. But just bear in mind that these are native plants. They're rather beautiful, I think, and they're really attractive to insects, to wildlife. These are all plants I've got in my garden. I grow ragwort there on the right. So we've got dandelions, of course, ragwort and spear thistle. The ragwort I've got in my herbaceous flower beds, and it looks beautiful. It doesn't take over. It's just like any other plant. I think we could all learn to be a little more accommodating, tolerant of wildflowers growing in our garden. In fact, I often say to people, you just remember one thing about wildlife gardening. It's this, that you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden in a click of your fingers by just renaming them all wildflowers. If you've got room, squeeze in flowering trees. Flowering trees produce enormous masses of blossom on a scale that herbaceous plants can't really equal because of the three-dimensional nature of trees. Of course, most of us don't have room in our gardens for a horse chestnut or a lime tree. But you might have room for a laburnum, which is much smaller, or for a fruit tree, particularly given that there are fruit trees on dwarfing rootstocks that are widely available that grow, that are restricted in size, some of them small enough to grow in a pot on a patio. And if you grow a tree, not only a flowering tree, not only are you giving the pollinators a treat, but they in return will pollinate it if it's a fruit tree, and you'll get your own 0 food miles fruit in the summer or autumn. And as it grows, it locks up carbon. Trees are good for the soil. There's winds all round if you can squeeze in flowering trees. I'd love it, actually, if we planted more flowering fruit trees in parks and city streets and so on. I have this sort of vision of a world in where kids on the way into school could pick apples and plums and pears and whatnot off the trees as they go. They'd probably throw them at each other. But anyway, I kind of think that would be rather cool. So there, flowering trees. Of course, most gardens have a lawn, and they tend to be rather sterile places from a wildlife point of view, particularly if they're that kind of manicured lawn that many British gardeners aspire to, the kind of trying to recreate a Wimbledon tennis court with stripes on it in our back garden. My dad does this, much to my shame. I've tried to persuade him, but I haven't succeeded. But maybe I'll succeed with you, if you're not already converted. So if we could just persuade people to relax a little and not mow so often. It's amazing how many flowers there already are in most lawns, particularly older lawns. So this is my lawn, and I haven't sown any wildflower seeds in it or plug plants or anything. I just don't mow it very often. And as soon as you stop mowing, it just springs into flower. You can see lots of white clover and a bit of red clover and buttercups and dandelions, and there's self-heal and speedwell and all sorts of things creeping about in there. Most of them really attractive to insects too. So if next time you get the urge to mow, you can instead sort of, try and calm down and make a coffee or a gin and tonic and get the deck chair out and just sit and admire the flowers and the bees. It's a much better way to spend your time than burning petrol with the mower. Of course, it's not just gardens. There are lots of mown grassland areas in every town, and they don't really need to be mown. Most of the time, at least, they don't. And I don't really understand why councils do spend so much time and money sending staff out, again, burning petrol, strimming and mowing the sides of roads and so on. Of course, sometimes there are visibility issues, but very often not. So this picture is of a road verge up in Stirling in Scotland, where I used to work. And there's this really wonderful little campaign group. They call themselves On the Verge. That's their funny little logo there at the front with a slightly deranged bee on it. These volunteers, they spend their weekends digging over any bit of amenity grassland that they can get their hands on and planting it with wildflowers. And they've done an amazing job. At the last count, there were 93 patches like this dotted all over Stirling, places that used to be boring mown grass and now are full of wildflowers. So that, as I say, as you can see, is a road verge, and there's a roundabout. Just imagine if every roundabout in Britain was covered in wildflowers and every road verge was covered in wildflowers. That would be an amazing network of habitat for insects. At the other end of the spectrum, look at that. Isn't that awful? This just makes me so angry. But it's a very common sight all around Britain. Many councils employ workmen, often on quad bikes with a big tank of herbicide on the back, and they drive around the streets looking for anything that remotely green and spraying it to kill it. You'll often see this along the edges of paths in parks, edges of school playgrounds, and here just in a city street. What harm was that little bit of greenery doing? I would suggest very little. might have supported a few insects, a few flowers, and now it's dead. What a sad sight that is.
We seem to have lost Dave. Just hang on, hopefully he reconnects. Hi Dave, you back? Yeah.
Am I back?
Just continue. Yeah.
Okay. I've no idea how much the network just cut me off for some reason. I've no idea how much I'd said, so I'll just carry on. But I was basically saying we shouldn't spray every last scrap of green vegetation in our streets with herbicide, particularly given that the most commonly used herbicide is glyphosate, and there's a growing body of evidence that glyphosate is really quite harmful to wildlife, to soils, and is probably a carcinogen to people, and yet we spray it in our playgrounds and pavements and places where our kids play, which seems absolutely nuts to me. I would love it if we banned pesticides completely in urban areas. And you might think that I'm sort of some crazy radical saying this, but actually we could do it so easily. There is just no need for these chemicals in our towns, in our gardens. The French last year banned all pesticides except for use by licensed farmers. Nobody can use them in urban areas. Nobody can use them in their gardens anymore. And if France can do that, we can do that. Anywhere could do that. There are some really great campaigns around Britain for pesticide-free towns. Some towns already well on their way down that route. And I'd love it if every town joined in. Let's get rid of the pesticides. From a gardening perspective, people are often tempted to go and buy a bug spray if they see aphids growing on their roses or on their runner beans or whatever it might be. I have a big garden, 2 acres, full of vegetables and fruit and flowers, and I occasionally get outbreaks of pests, but I just leave them, and almost invariably within a few days you get a whole army of natural enemies come along and eat those pests. These are just some of the insects that you'll find in any garden that will come to your rescue. The cavalry will charge in and demolish the pests for you. If that doesn't happen, the very worst thing is you've still got some aphids on your runner beans and maybe your yield won't be quite as high as it might have been. Is that really such a bad thing? And is that really worse than spraying a bunch of poison around in your garden? I would suggest not. And just to add to that, actually, I mean, if you find that there are certain plants in your garden that are persistently affected badly by pests, you're probably just growing the wrong plants, and it's best to switch to growing things better suited to the conditions. If a plant is stressed because it's not happy, then it can't defend itself against pests and it tends to suffer. On the subject of pesticides, one other thing to be aware of is that even if you don't use pesticides in your garden, you may well have a dog or cat and drip pesticides onto its neck once a month at the advice of your vet. This is the best-selling brand of flea treatment used on dogs and cats in Europe, and it's called Advocate, but its active ingredient is something called imidacloprid. It's a neonicotinoid insecticide. That's a type of insecticide that's now been banned from farming use, but you can still drip it on your dog. And beware, because the dose that you're supposed to put on the neck of a medium-sized dog is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. That's enough honeybees to fill 4 big lorries with dead honeybees. And we recently published a paper, just last week in fact, showing that these chemicals used as flea treatments are routinely turning up in rivers. In fact, every river in England that was screened contained measurable quantities of these pet fleas, which is really concerning, given that these are potent neurotoxic insecticides and they're swilling around in our rivers. There was no sampling done in Wales that I'm aware of, but I'd be amazed if every English river is contaminated, if most Welsh ones weren't as well. Okay, two more things to finish off your perfect insect-friendly garden. You can have a bee hotel. Everyone's heard of these days. These provide homes for solitary bees, bees that nest on their own, and some of them like a little tunnel. That's on the left there is a fence post that I drilled some holes in. It looks a mess because it's half rotten, but the bees don't seem to care. And within 20 minutes of drilling the first holes, I had one of those red mason bees, top right, coming to investigate. They're on the wing in early spring, March, April time, so not so long now. And then later in the year, you get leafcutter bees, bottom right, which will occupy any holes that the mason bees haven't filled up first. As I say, you can make your own very easily by drilling holes in a block of wood, or these are slightly more attractive ones made from bits of bamboo, which work reasonably well. Or if you've got these are great projects to do with kids, it's a nice sort of fun activity for the weekend. Or you can buy a bee hotel. There are lots of different ones available. This is quite a cool one that has a window that you can sort of removable door on the side there. And on the right, you can see what goes on inside the tunnels. These are all mason bee offspring, little piles of yellow pollen and comma-shaped fat grubs feeding up, separated by little walls of clay. Really, again, great kind of ways of engaging children. The final thing I'd say for gardens, just for a bit of extra fun, really, why not try making a hoverfly lagoon? Again, fun thing to do with the kids at the weekend. These work really well. They were invented by a former PhD student of mine, Ellie Rotheray, who did her PhD on hoverflies. And there are some species of hoverfly which are rather beautiful as adults and important pollinators. There's two of them on the right there. But that have aquatic larvae. They lay their eggs in small puddles, and it's really easy to create the right conditions. You just need a waterproof container of any sort, really, and fill it up with water, chuck in some leaves or lawn clippings, and within a few days, the bit of luck, you'll get female flies coming and laying their eggs, which hatch and produce these rather fascinating larvae at the top there. The common name is a rat-tailed maggot, which doesn't do them any great favors, I'm afraid, but I think they're really rather cool. The tail is a snorkel. It's a breathing tube so that the fat grub can lurk deep in the murky water where a bird can't see it and eat it, and it can still breathe using its tail. Rather cool organisms, and as I say, you can find instructions about how to make one online, but it's really very, very simple. Okay, so that's the main thing I think that most of us can easily get involved in, trying to turn our urban areas into insect-friendly habitat. And that would be great. It would be fantastic if we did that. But 70% of Britain is farmland. And at present, a lot of that is really quite hostile to life. So I want to spend the last 5 minutes or so talking about how we might make our farmland more welcoming to biodiversity and particularly to insects. And really, I haven't got time to go into this in great depth, but I'd like to make some kind of points about at least the principles about how we might grow food in the future. So farming has become more and more intensive over time. Fields have got bigger, it's become more and more mechanized, more and more pesticides are being used. I mentioned earlier this figure of 17.4 spray applications a year. It's the average per field, and that's a figure that's increased 60% in the last 25 years. So we're spraying more and more, we're farming ever more intensively. And most of us, I think, just implicitly accept that this is necessary because the human population has grown enormously and is set to grow more. The 7.5 billion of us, there's probably going to be 10, 11, maybe 12 billion of us quite soon. And we need to feed everybody. And so I think most people just accept that this kind of big scale intensive farming is a necessary evil. It's the only way we can feed everyone. Well, I would disagree. I actually think that if we carry on down this route, people will starve in the future because I don't think this kind of approach to food production is sustainable in the long term. for three reasons, really. Firstly, because food production currently contributes nearly a third of all greenhouse gas emissions, which clearly we have to stop. Secondly, it's doing enormous damage to soils around the world. We're seeing staggering levels of soil erosion. And obviously we need soils if we're going to grow healthy crops. And then finally, because this approach to farming is wiping out biodiversity, it's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss globally. And we need natural enemies of crop pests, and we need pollinators, we need biodiversity. And so if we end up with no soil and no pollinators, how on earth are we going to grow food in the future? So I think we need to be very careful about where we go with food production and question this kind of intensive model of food production. Not least because, another interesting feature of this is that right now we produce about 3 times as much food as actually we need, in the sense that we produce 3 times as many calories as it would require to feed the global population, just in terms of calories. But then we throw away a third of it, which is absolutely nuts. We do all this intensive farming at huge cost to the environment and then casually discard the produce. It's madness. And surely we can do better than wasting a third of food. Of course, you'll never get rid of all food waste, but surely we can do better than at present. So we waste a third of it, and then we feed roughly another third of all the calories that are grown as crops to animals, for us to then eat the animals. Now, I'm very aware that Wales is a country with lots of sheep and cows, but it is a simple truth, whether you like it or not, that eating meat isn't a particularly efficient way of feeding people. And that if we treated meat as a treat, as something we ate occasionally, as a luxury, then that would be much more sustainable, and it would reduce the area of land that is required to feed the human population. And that's a simple fact. I'm not vegan or even vegetarian. I just try to not eat very much meat, and particularly avoid indoor grain-fed red meat, which is about the worst thing possible for the environment. So, sorry about this picture. So just to recap, we waste a third of the food, we feed roughly a third of our crops to animals, and then we overconsume. And so this is a global problem, not just a Western problem. We eat far more than is good for us. And not only do we eat too much, but we eat the wrong kind of food. We eat processed food, which is high in carbs and fats. And that, not only is it wasteful to eat more than you need, but it's making us unwell, and it's hurting the economy. So in the UK, all over the world now, we have an obesity crisis, which leads to all sorts of health complications. And a UK government survey recently estimated that the health costs associated with obesity costing the economy £27 billion a year. That's a lot of money, and it's rapidly rising as the obesity problem rises. So that's just crazy, isn't it? Why do we do it? Why do we eat the wrong kind of food that's bad for us, and eat way more than we need to? We need to somehow persuade people to rein this in. Part of the problem is because agriculture is focused globally on growing cereals and oils, these commodity crops on a huge scale. You saw those fields in North America of cereal crops being grown over fields of multiple square miles inside. Those cereals, as we'll see in a second, and oil crops go mainly to produce food that isn't particularly healthy. So we're growing too much of those and not enough fruit and veg in the little box down to the right there, which means that our diets end up being composed largely of calories and fats, pizzas and pasta and pastries and pies and cakes and biscuits and so on, and not of the things that are good for us, the fruits and veg. We need to grow more of those and far less of these commodity crops, I would argue. Now, that's all very well, but I personally think not just that we should grow less of those crops, but that we should think about different types of farming. if we really want to grow food sustainably. And the reason I say that is this might seem a bit of a strange tangent to go off on, but we've been doing work on allotments. We in and around Brighton, mainly around the University of Sussex where I work. And we've been studying the productivity of allotments. We've been getting people to weigh all the fruits and vegetables they produce so that we can calculate how much they're growing in total. And it's really surprising, the more competent allotmenters grow staggering amounts of food. The scaled up to a per hectare level, a good allotmenter can get about 35 tons of fruit and veg from his or her allotment a year. And that's 0 food miles, 0 packaging, often pesticide free, healthy food available for immediate consumption. And if you compare that to a farmer growing wheat, for example, the biggest crop in Britain, he gets about 8 tons per hectare, even with all the fertilizers and pesticides and mechanization and so on. So this kind of approach to food production may not look efficient, but actually it produces a lot of food. But there's more to it than that, which is why I'm talking about it. Because a study from Bristol University recently found that allotments are also the richest places for biodiversity in urban areas. They're better than gardens, better even than urban nature reserves. So the reason I'm mentioning allotments is very simple. They show that you can grow lots of food and have biodiversity in the same place. Incidentally, they tend to have more carbon in the soil, and there's evidence that having an allotment makes you healthier. So there are lots of reasons why people ought to want to grow their own food in an allotment, and why there are currently 90,000 people in the UK on waiting lists for allotments. I think government should try and find land for them to have their allotments so they can grow their own healthy food and be healthier and lock carbon up in the soil and look after biodiversity. So that's great. But I'm not suggesting we can feed everyone in the world through allotments. Clearly we can't. But there are types of farming that use similar principles and are similarly productive. And let's just very quickly look at a few. Things like agroforestry and permaculture and biodynamic farming. I don't know how many of you are familiar with biodynamic farming, but it has certain aspects of kind of witchcraft and wizardry thrown in, potions and so on. But actually, 99% of what biodynamic farmers do is incredibly sensible from an ecological perspective. All of these types of farming have certain things in common. They aim to be truly sustainable rather than unsustainable. They look after the soil and soil health as a core focus of their activities rather than depleting soils. They support biodiversity because they recognize the need for the natural enemies of crop pests. If you're not going to rely on pesticides, then you need the ladybirds and lacewings and hoverflies and earwigs and so on. They're carbon neutral or carbon negative rather than contributing massively to greenhouse gas emissions. Biodynamic farming and permaculture are both completely pesticide free and yet still very productive. And at the end of the day, they're types of farming focused on producing food that is good for humans in a sustainable way. And that surely is what we should be looking for from a farming system, rather than growing huge areas of commodity crops that are then either used to produce food that's unhealthy or go to waste or are fed to animals, which is surely not an efficient way of looking after people. So to wrap up, back here to this picture of our planet. As I said at the beginning, we're making a terrible mess and we have to do better. I find it really astonishing that people would do anything for their children apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. But we can do better, and maybe one easy place to start is by looking after all the little creatures that live in our gardens. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. Really welcome your views. Really like the idea of sitting back, letting the garden grow, having a G&T. Really sound advice, I think, for all of us. But it also, that talk, I think, really threw up some fundamental questions that we have about this apocalyptic future that we're facing. Let's face it, no insects, no wildlife. And I think we're all facing that reality, and we all want to know what role that we can play in this. Particularly interested in that session, a bit of a shout out there for the Wildlife Trust Action for Insects campaign. I know you're an ambassador for the Wildlife Trust at the moment. The Land Workers Alliance, and also the Community Landowners Association is trying to assist communities and people to grow more sustainable food. And you're quite right, let's learn from those lessons of community land ownership. A couple of questions there I want to come to as well, but great. Keep tapping away at the advice and links in the chat there. It's really important that we share information on this. And we can continue these debates as well going through the conference, and I'll do a plug for those sessions in the future. But Dave, a couple of questions from the audience. Andrew Lucas asked that it's quite common for us now to see roundabouts or roadside verges looking amazing, very colourful. But he wants to know if there's any real hard data to show that these are useful for pollinators.
Well, so those pictures I showed from Stirling, I actually had an MSc student who counted the abundance of hoverflies and wild bees in the areas that had been sown with wildflowers, and compared them with areas that had just been left as they were managed before. And not surprisingly, she found, I can't remember I think it was 13 times as many hoverflies and 50 times as many bees in the transformed flower-rich areas. So they certainly provide food for pollinating insects. There's no doubt about that. There is a related question, which I can't give you a firm answer on, but which slightly troubles me, which is that you are luring insects to an area with lots of traffic. And there is a slight concern that you might obviously be increasing the number of insects that get splattered, poor things. My instinct is that probably it does a lot more good than harm, but nobody, to my knowledge, has studied that yet. And so there is a little bit of concern there. But I think particularly in places urban areas where the traffic is moving slowly, it's very likely that the net benefit is a positive one.
Thanks for that. I think it's also great just to increase the awareness and understanding of how you can actually attract insects and just how amazingly colourful. It's much better to be sat in your car looking at amazing wild flowers than some mown grass, even worse, a sprayed brown desert. Liz Hancock asked, how long do you think it will take to reverse the decline in the insects? And in Wales and the UK, what do you think success would look like?
How long would it take? Well, honestly, that really comes down to us, because insects they respond amazingly quickly. If you provide them with habitat, one female insect can produce hundreds of eggs, and in no time at all, you've got lots of them. So it's just down to us. How fast can we provide them with suitable habitat? And that, is down to, I mean, you can change your garden tomorrow, and admittedly at this time of year you won't see any results, but as soon as spring comes you will see measurable benefits, more insects if you grow insect-friendly flowers. But to achieve a national transformation, it really obviously needs, well, either sort of top-down, support from government, or a massive popular sort of rising where we all start planting insect-friendly flowers everywhere and demand that our local council stop mowing the verges and roundabouts and all the many things that we all know we should do but often don't get around to. It's just down to us. I think we could stop insect declines in no time at all, within a year, if we really pulled our fingers out. But of course we won't. And the difficulty is engaging with enough people and persuading them that these issues are important. I think everyone in the environmental world right now is somewhat frustrated that awareness is growing, but it's too slow. And politicians, although they're starting now to take climate change seriously, they're not really taking the biodiversity crisis anywhere near seriously enough, I don't think. And the majority of the public are still not really strongly engaged. You know, they're too busy, I don't know, watching the football, earning a living, paying the mortgage. They just haven't realized that actually the future of their children is at stake. And that sounds super dramatic, but I honestly believe it to be true. But unless we can persuade people of that and get them to therefore take action, then we're going to struggle.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's about this awareness, isn't it? And increasing the understanding of actually what's happening out there. And you showed what I call the wall of death in the supermarket, and people just walking on casually, putting these poisons into their basket and going out to the
Yeah,
checkout as if they're some
it's
ordinary
astonishing, really.
commodity that we should all be.
Yeah, I mean, these are bought by people with no training who probably don't always read the back of the label and don't wear rubber gloves when they're spraying them and so on. It's nuts, really, you know, because they're quite nasty chemicals, some of them.
Yeah, certainly. Had a question through from next questions. We keep the questions coming, by the way, everybody. Have a question here from Sue Colwell. Just reading this is saying, what about the effects of the fumes on the insects? Does it have a similar effect to the pesticides?
Car fumes, I assume this we're talking about, are we? Yeah. So I know of one scientific study which showed, it was quite an interesting one. It showed that the diesel fumes made it harder for bees to find the flowers because it was masking the scent of the flowers. But other than that, as far as I'm aware, there's been no real study of this. I'd love to know. So it's not so much fumes, but I think there's real reason to be concerned over the effects of particulate pollution on insects, because insects breathe they have these little holes along their sides which open into little networks of air tubes which are very narrow, and any kind of particulate dust that gets in them could easily block them up, and nobody's looked at you know, we know that these particulates are really bad for people and they reduce our life expectancy if we breathe them in and so on. We have no idea. As far as I'm aware, there's not been a single study anywhere in the world on whether these particulates are harming insect life. One of the many unknowns, actually. But I sort of got a long-term plan to try and get some funding for this, but I haven't as yet got round to it.
Okay, we also had Jamie Bakes just asking, is there some advice just on really, sometimes it's problematic, isn't it, growing wildflowers and getting them to take. Do you have any advice about how best to introduce wildflowers to your garden?
I don't generally find most of them particularly difficult, as long as you're trying to grow ones that are, as I mentioned, sort of, you know, ones that would grow naturally in your region, that are suited to the climate and the soil and so on. I mean, actually, most wildflowers are pretty robust and able to look after themselves. They have to be to survive. So, I mean, there's lots of advice out there. It depends whether you're trying to create a wildflower meadow or just grow wildflowers in a flower bed or whatever. I do both. I grow up lots of wildflower seeds in trays and pop them up in the greenhouse and then plant them out into flower beds. And most of them look after themselves. You know, they're really robust. If you're trying to get more flowers in a lawn or in a meadow area, or if you're turning your lawn into a meadow, then yellow rattle is worth thinking about including, which is it's called a hemiparasite, but it's a lovely native wildflower, but it's parasitic on grasses, so it reduces the vigor of the grasses in a meadow area, and therefore leaves more space for invasion by flowering wildflowers. So sow some rattle seed if you're trying to get more wildflowers into a grassy area. But generally, you know, there's no real fundamental difference between propagating wildflowers and propagating any other plant.
Okay, that's great. But yeah, keep trying, keep persisting. They're wonderful when they do come through. So Geffin Jenkins-Jones has asked the question, will the Asian hornet have a devastating effect on bumblebees or primarily honeybees?
So the Asian hornet, if those of you may not know, it was accidentally brought from China in a consignment of pottery that went to Bordeaux. I forget how many years ago now, 10 or 20 years ago. And it's been spreading across Europe. And there's been all sorts of crazy headlines in newspapers in the UK warning that the giant Asian hornet was coming, and giving the impression that it was a threat to human life and might carry off our dogs and the like. It's actually smaller than the native hornet. It's no threat at all to people, but it is camped out on the north coast of France, and there've been a number of sightings and some nests found in southern Britain. I think it's inevitable that it will successfully colonize southern Britain, and it is certainly another problem for honeybee keepers, because it has a real taste for honeybees, and will repeatedly visit a hive or an apiary, and they just pick the workers off one by one. They do also happily eat bumblebees and other wild insects, grasshoppers, and all sorts of things. So it is a concern, but unfortunately, there's not a great deal that can be done. The government have instigated a kind of a program to try and eradicate any that established, but I think it will happen. And we just, like other invasive species, once they're here, it'll be impossible to undo, I fear.
Yeah, it's increasing, a worrying trend, isn't it, going forward? Alison Fraser is asking, has the loss of village ponds contributed significantly to insect loss?
I would imagine so, although freshwater insects aren't my speciality, but they're roughly 10% of insect life is aquatic. Ponds, can be extraordinary places for insect life. You think of all the dragonflies and damselflies and water beetles and so on. And some of them have declined. So one would imagine, not just village ponds, but farmers used to have ponds in their fields for livestock to drink from, and most of those have been filled up over the last 100 years. One imagines that must have had a significant effect on aquatic insects. All the more reason to have a pond in your garden.
David Purden.
Sorry.
Yes, please do. Even a small bucket, everything makes a difference. David Purden asked the first conspiracy theory question of today. He said he understands that pesticides, especially organic phosphates, are added to aviation fuel as a lubricant. Is this something that we should be seriously worried about, or is it a bit of a conspiracy theory?
I think that's a conspiracy theory. I can't honestly think that it makes sense to put organophosphates in aviation fuel, but I'm willing to be corrected if someone's got some hard evidence. But I think insects do have many genuine problems, but as far as I'm aware, different one.
Yeah, no. So I've definitely heard about antibacteria in aviation fuel, because they're amazingly adaptive even in those harsh environments. Margaret Trigar, is there research on the impacts of ammonia on insect populations?
Ooh, none that I know of. Very short answer.
Okay. And I think just looking now, keep the questions coming in. We've got a couple of minutes left before we have to close this session. But Graham Osborne is asked,
Sorry, I can't hear anything.
Can you not hear? Is that just
Sorry, I didn't get anything for the last 20 seconds. I don't know.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question here for Graham Osborne. Is there any altitude limitation for insects if they were to push green roofs? Could the height of a building make a green roof inaccessible for colonization by insects without stepping stones or smaller building or living walls nearby?
So there's certainly no altitude limit, or at least not one that is relevant within the height of buildings. Just to give you an extreme example, there are bumblebees in the Himalayas that live up to about 4,500 meters. So I don't think there's any danger that they wouldn't be able to get to the top of a tall building. But some insects would probably not naturally go that high. There are quite a lot of butterflies that tend to stay low to the ground and probably wouldn't discover a green roof, but there are plenty of others that would, and I'm a big fan. I think we should use every available surface and make it green and welcoming to wildlife, so I'm all for it, whatever height they are. I certainly know people who've put flowers on a balcony on the 16th floor of a block of flats and had plentiful bees sniffing out the flowers and coming to visit.
Brilliant, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that, Dave, today. It's really good to increase awareness, and thank you very much for your wisdom and your hard work. I know you're a trustee of the Pesticide Action Network, and I would recommend people go to that site and join in the campaigns there. And this debate continues throughout the next 5 days of the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. Tomorrow we're looking at addressing resilient ecological networks at 10 o'clock. And on Thursday at 12:30, we're also looking at nature-friendly use of green spaces from roadside verges throughout. So thank you very much, Dave, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We are now going to have a break, but we'll be coming back at 3:30 to listen to John Clark from NRW and a really exciting multi-partnership project to bring back nature. So please do join us at 3:30, and we can provide all the presentations, etc., from today on the Wales Biodiversity Partnership website. Thank you very much. Diolch.